It doesn't matter what your personal circumstances are. There's always something that isn't right near you, isn't correct, isn't laid out properly, that you could just fix if you wanted to. There's no shortage of opportunities to do that. You can do that in your own mind. You can do that in your own room. You can do that in your own household, in your local community. And maybe if you get good at doing it at all those levels, then you can start to look beyond that. If you adopt an attitude that the role that you should play is to make things better wherever you are, however you can, that what would actually happen would be that things would get better wherever you are. The world shifts itself around your aim. Because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. So that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim. And then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems. And if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim. And you can concentrate on the day. And so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. An uphill trajectory is actually even better than being somewhere good as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that really makes your life meaningful is the clear realization that you're headed somewhere better than you are now. And then it's even better if you also understand that there's a direct causal relationship between the things that you're doing and the steepness of that incline. There's two modes of being in the world, right? There's one where you adopt the responsibility for living properly, for being properly, and you make the sacrifices necessary for doing that, and then everything will flourish properly. And the other one is a pathway of resentment and bitterness and rejection and genocide. If you make your life 0.1% better a week, man, in 2 or 3 years, you're in such a better place than you were that it isn't even like the same domain. And if you keep that up for 10 years or 20 years, especially if you're young and you start early, you start to straighten yourself out and fix the things that you can fix. You can transform your lives in ways that are completely unimaginable. And God only knows what the upper limit of that is in terms of human possibility. What you're actually made of, what you're made of is what you encounter when you voluntarily encounter the unknown. And so the more you voluntarily encounter the unknown, the more you get made of. And the more you get made of, the more there is to you. And then the more you're good at encountering the unknown and restructuring order and calling forth proper order out of the potential of being. And God, you got to think, why wouldn't you do that since you can do that? The fact that you're fragile is actually a precondition for your heroism, because if you weren't fragile, then there'd be nothing heroic about doing something difficult, right? Because if you couldn't be hurt or damaged or defeated or end up in failure, then where's the moral courage in the endeavor? It has to be that the fragility is built into the courage. People denigrate the opportunities that are right in front of them. And there's no reason to do that, because what's right in front of you is the majesty of being. That's what's right in front of you. It's inexhaustibly complex and full of potential. And there's no reason to assume that wherever you happen to be isn't as good a starting place as anywhere else. Well, I know some people have terrible, terrible lives. They're in situations that are absolutely unbearable. But I also do know that even situations like that can be made a hell of a lot worse by the worst kind of attitude. That's for sure. What I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. I mean, I'm still trying to do that, because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. I think alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then They come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen. The issue is there are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception. It's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. Where are you once you destroy your own ideal? What's left for you? There's nowhere to go. There's no up. And when there's no up, there's a lot of down. If you destroy your own ideal, which you do with jealousy and resentment and the desire to pull down people who you would like to be, let's say, then you end up in a situation that's indistinguishable from hell. Your moral degeneration contributes in no small way to the degeneration of the entire cosmos. Stop cheating at whatever game it is that you've chosen to play. That's a good start, and that'll straighten out your life. Just exactly what are your motives? If you're not doing something important with your life, maybe you're prone to cause trouble just because you don't have anything better to do. Because at least trouble is more interesting than boring. And so if you're not doing something, if you're not pushing yourself to the limits of your capacity, then you have plenty of leftover willpower, energy, and resources to devote to causing interesting trouble. There are so many things that need doing that all you really have to do is open your eyes and look at them and then decide that you're actually going to do something about them. And you might think, well, what's within my scope of influence is so trivial that it's not worth doing. It's like, it won't stay trivial for long if you do it. Not at all. And I don't think it's trivial to begin with. I really don't believe that anything done right is trivial. And my experience in my life has been that anything I actually did paid off. It didn't pay off necessarily in the way that I expected it to pay off. That's a whole different story. But if it was genuine commitment to do something, even if it went sideways and the outcome was really something other than what I expected, the net consequence over time was nothing but good. So every new frontier that can be conquered is an advance forward, and there's no shortage of frontier because we're surrounded by the unknown. We're surrounded by our own ignorance, and that's the secret to proper being. If you're interested in life, if you're interested in proper being, and you're disinclined to produce any more suffering than necessary, then you want to know how to conduct yourself when the catastrophe comes so that you have a reasonable possibility of moving through it. If you dare to do the most difficult thing that you can conceptualize, your life will work out better than it will if you do anything else. Well, how are you going to find out if that's true? Well, it's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it. So no one can tell you either. You have to be all in this game. There is no more effective way of operating in the world than to conceptualize the highest good that you can and then strive to attain it. There's no better pathway to self-realization and the ennoblement of being than to posit the highest good that you can conceive of and commit yourself to it. You can take whatever job you have and you can make it a real nice little piece of absolute misery. Or you can act like a civilized human being and notice that no matter where you are, there's a richness and a complexity that's completely inexhaustible right at hand. And then you can take that seriously and you can say, well, I can make it a lot better if I want to. I can get along properly with my coworkers and not gossip behind their back. And I can treat my customers properly. And if an opportunity comes my way, I can take it and I can see what happens. This is, I think, why people are so obsessed in some sense with the search for fundamental meaning. This is a good story. So you can imagine two people laying bricks. They're building a gigantic wall. And the one person thinks, oh my God, this wall is going to take 100,000 bricks. I'm laying one at a time and I'm wasting my life away, trivially adding to this gigantic brick wall. And what am I doing? This is absolutely miserable, brick by brick. And the other person thinks, in 300 years, this is going to be a cathedral. And so the person in the second state is doing exactly the same thing at a local level, laying bricks, but each brick is related to a very high goal. And that means the reward that's attendant upon the laying of the brick is proportional to the goal of the entire behavioral process. So if you're aimless and goalless, then you can't elicit any positive emotion. And if your goals are fragmented, which is also what happens if you're aimless or your goals lack unity. If your goals are fragmented, then no given behavioral manifestation can elicit any dopaminergic reward because it's not a step forward to anything desirable. One of the things, I did write about this in my first book, particularly about putting your house in perfect order. It's like, if you're lost, one of the things you can do is look around and see what direction you could take locally. Fix something. Find something that you could do that would make things better that you would do. And there's a humility in that too, because especially if you're in a low energy state, it's like, oh my God, I don't have enough energy to make dinner. It's like, do you have enough energy to put a fork on the table? And sometimes people are so depressed that that's really all they can do. Can you take a small step forward, no matter how small that is? Implement a micro routine, even something like washing a cup and putting it back in the shelf. And that's a good thing because you have a shelf and there's cups on it. You've already decided that's an appropriate way to live, is to have your coffee cups on a shelf. If you go ahead with cleaning out the cup and putting it on the shelf, then you've taken steps towards a valuable micro goal. You get a dopamine kick from that. That transforms itself into adrenaline and energizes you. In part, what the dopamine system is doing. So imagine that the purpose of the dopamine system is to elicit a satiating reward, fundamentally. But then the satiating reward is something that has to be approached in steps. And so in order to maintain the motivation necessary to approach the satiating reward, you have to mark each of the steps with a marker of pleasure. Small things are not small. You might have the cognitive appraisal that doing something local, like cleaning up your room, is small, but it's not obvious at all that that's the case. It's not that trivial to put your immediate surroundings in order. And it can easily be the stepping stone to putting things in order on a broader scale. In fact, it's probably the necessary stepping stone to do that. You can pat yourself on the back, especially if you're depressed, a little harder than you might otherwise by saying, you say, well, this is trivial, but I did it. It's like, no, if you're moving ahead, that's not small. You just keep doing that, and you're going to get out of this paralyzed or retreat mode. If you're in the zone of proximal development, you're pushing your skill development one increment forward. And it's one that you can actually manage. Imagine that you have someone who's habitually avoidant. And maybe they're avoidant because when they become possessed by negative emotion, they become hyper aware of their internal state and they feel the panic. And so then they freeze or retreat. And they do that constantly. And then they're in this terrible negative emotional state all the time because every time they see a stimulus that's associated with retreat, they get gripped by these interoceptive sensations. And so you say to them, well, we're going to reverse that. Instead of you being gripped by that, you're going to expose yourself to that voluntarily. If you do that repeatedly with people, not only do they stop being afraid of the things that you're showing them, that you're exposing them to, but they become more likely to approach other things they're afraid of, far more likely. In fact, it doesn't exactly look like people get less afraid at all. It looks like what happens is they learn to get braver. One of the cognitive phenomena that loads very heavily on neuroticism is self-consciousness. And so when you fall into anxiety, then there is this internal obsessiveness, which has to do with the panoply of sins in some sense. Which parts of me are malfunctioning and need to be eradicated? And one of the things I used to do with my socially anxious clients, so they would go into a social situation, often with eyes downcast, by the way, and they would be so intensely concentrating on their own internal sensations that they would fail to make eye contact with anybody they were talking to. And then they would be awkward because they weren't reading the cues they could have read if they would have only looked. And then the conversation would become disjointed. And then they would get anxious and fall into themselves. And so one of the things that I taught them to do wasn't to try to calm themselves down, but to try to calm the other person down. So when you go into a social situation, pay more attention to the other person. Like just focus your attention outward. And if the person had any social skill, sometimes I had clients who had no social skills. And so they were anxious socially because they actually didn't know how to behave socially. So then you had to teach them the social skills. But some of them had the skills but wouldn't activate them because they were so neurotically obsessed with their own inadequacy that they failed to attend to the cues that would elicit the proper responses. And all they had to learn to do was watch. And then they would automatically respond because they knew how to have a conversation. See, the reason that socially anxious people are so interoceptive is it's involuntary, right? They get gripped by the negative emotion, and then that produces this intense, obsessive interoception. That might not happen if they did it voluntarily. This is why exposure therapy works so well in psychotherapy. Is like, well, I'm afraid of something, and if I go near it, then I'm possessed by negative emotion. Well, that's if you go near it accidentally. I'm going to have you go near it purposefully. And what you're going to find is that to the degree that you do it purposefully, that response will be quelled. And that happens. It's extraordinarily reliable. Imagine you anticipate something and then you make a mistake. Now, the question then becomes, how significant is the mistake? The depressive takes that punishment response, let's say, that's a consequence of failed anticipation and can't bind it. It just takes out all of their potential future selves. And so then they're in a depressive pit. That's too much learning from failure. That binding problem is really tricky. One of the rules of thumb for that that's extremely useful, that's socially instantiated, is innocent until proven guilty. So you might say when those thoughts come up, because they're adversarial and accusatory thoughts, you might say, well, that is part of the realm of possibility. But when your child does something wrong that's minor, you don't say you're a rotten kid. You bind it. You say, look, kid, here's a bunch of things you're doing right. But in this particular example, specific situation, here's the minimal thing you did incorrectly and how to alter it. And it's a really good habit of mind to address towards yourself as well as to other people, which is to say, well, what's the minimum crime that I'm responsible for in this moment? And that's part of this miracle of the presumption of innocence, and especially without proof. A lot of what I did in my clinical practice to people who had a depressive temperament was help them make a case for themselves. It's like, well, maybe you're as bad as you think you might be, but maybe not. Let's take the contrary argument and only narrow the repair to the absolute minimum that needs to be manifested. Sometimes when you make one little mistake, it is actually an indicator of a flaw in your character. But most of the time it isn't. And it certainly can't be responded to that all the time, because then you'd never be able to make a mistake without wiping yourself completely out. You want to make it as local and precise as you possibly can. And that's also one of the advantages to removing yourself from a rage or an anxiety state, because a rage or an anxiety state is low resolution and global. And so it'll be globally accusatory. So you want to specify it and think, okay, well, what's the minimum necessary behavioral transformation to ensure that similar mistakes are not replicated in the future? It's like if your roof leaks, you don't have to dig a new foundation. You can just fix a few shingles. And you might think, well, the rain's coming through, so you have to tear down the whole house. It's like, well, no. And you might panic and run around because the water's coming in, but it's still a bad idea to dig up the foundations every time something trivial maintenance problem needs to emerge. And so one of the things that's very useful to learn is like, well, is this only a trivial maintenance problem? And one of the advantages to that too is that if it's not the collapse of your entire self, let's say, and it's a trivial maintenance problem, you're much more able to activate that courageous response to anomaly that's part and parcel of exploratory behavior and eventual success. So, and part of the trick of many sorts of, well, I would say religious training enterprises, certainly the meditative enterprises, is something like, how do you tell yourself a story, like a real story, though, a story that actually works, where you can confidently approach the thing that's blocking your path?
You said that a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. How should people become more dangerous?
Becoming more articulate is definitely, I would say, that's the primary array of weapons. So, I mean, physical prowess is something, and it's not nothing, that physical confidence that comes along with that as well. But the same thing replicated at the level of the ability to communicate and to think, that's way broader field of battle and opportunity. You want to take your rightful place in the kingdom? It's like, get your tongue straight, man. Get it under control in the highest possible sense. There's nothing that makes you more formidable than verbal competence, than being able to articulate, be able to think, to marshal your arguments, right? Some battlefield metaphor. Get everything in order, all your information straight, to marshal your forces.
Is it possible to have too much responsibility, to take too much responsibility for yourself?
You can, for sure. Yeah, definitely. Dostoevsky said that every man was responsible for everything he did and for everything that everyone else does. Which is kind of an insane statement, but also somewhat, it's true in a certain sense. You do have an indefinite responsibility, and you do have an indefinite capacity to bear that responsibility, but that doesn't mean it can't be crushing. And then I would say the antidote to that is that you're not in this alone. As your responsibilities mount and your opportunities increase, you have to delegate more and more. It's important that you do everything you can, but there's enough for everyone to do. And so you might say, well, the heroic path is one that leads to universal redemption, and that's true. And you might say, well, that's all on you. It's like, it is in a sense, but then the problem that you just described, it can be unsustainable, right? You can torture yourself for not doing it well enough. And it is up to you, but it's not up to you alone. It's not up to you alone. So you delegate and you help build people around you so that they're all working in the same direction. It's an effort multiplier in any case. And you make sure that they get credit. Credit's good enough. It's not exactly right. The rewards are in accordance with their efforts, and you can distribute that. If you can routinize something and parse it off to someone else, say, here's a little kingdom for you, and it doesn't have to be little, and it's something that can grow, but here's a kingdom for you, well, then you can go off and do the next thing you need to do, which is extremely important. And you might think there's a kingdom and then it's broken into little kingdoms. And so the farther you are down the hierarchy, the smaller the kingdom you get. But that's only true if you think the world's a zero-sum game, because you could also think of it as a place of indefinite number of the largest kingdoms possible. And I think, why do we think this is exhaustible in some sense, what we're doing? It doesn't look exhaustible. That's the limits to growth mentality. It's like, economists don't believe in that. Because they think, well, no, we can just get more efficient, which we certainly are. We're way more efficient than we once were. And those gains in efficiency, when they're not being interfered with, are increasing at more than an arithmetic rate.
Why do you think people have a tendency toward that zero-sum mentality?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are elements of life that have a zero-sum element. I mean, if you're competing with another man, for example, to marry a particular woman, that's a zero-sum game if you only think of the game as including you two and that woman. So you can set up circumstances that are zero-sum, but to take that metaphor of zero-sum game, where there has to be winners and losers because there's a finite number of resources, is to assume that the rules of that game are the rules that govern the set of all games. And that's just not true. Games are infinitely multipliable. I mean, you can invent a new game. People do that all the time. The man who invented Catan, which is a game I really like to play, it's a very popular board game. That didn't exist until he invented it. Now, thousands and thousands of people play it, and he made a fortune from it. It's like that game never existed. So there doesn't seem to be any limit to the number of games we can invent. And it's a complicated problem because we are on a single planet, and some resources are more zero-sum than others, but we haven't really run into any actual zero-sum limits in terms of our, the probability of us living an abundant life on the planet. We've stewarded some resources very stupidly. We've done a very bad job of managing oceanic production, for example. And we have to be smart about our resources, but that doesn't mean they're zero-sum, and certainly doesn't mean the world is a zero-sum game. And that's a Malthusian idea, that population will grow till it consumes all available resources and precipitously collapse. And then why do we think apocalyptically? It's, because things do come to sudden ends. People die, people get fatal illnesses, like the world you so carefully constructed can be blown apart at any moment by a random occurrence, genetic mutation that causes the cancer that kills you. Life has a fundamentally apocalyptic aspect. And we do understand that because we're self-conscious, and then it's very difficult not to apply that kind of apocalyptic reasoning to things as such. The world's going to burn up. The climate's too hot. What about runaway positive feedback loops? Because that's what the climate types are afraid of. It's like, hey, they happen. How do we bind our apocalyptic thinking? That's a good question, man. That's a good question. We do that with the truth. That's how we do it. Through dialogue, through investigation, through exploration, through discipline, all of that. The logos is the antidote to the apocalypse. And so what does that mean? Well, love and truth is the antidote to the apocalypse. Not the planet has too many people on it.
Truth in the service of love.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a hierarchy of virtue, I would say. There's an old idea that God is the sum of all that's good. I don't think sum is exactly the right metaphor. It's more like, imagine there are eternal verities: truth, beauty, justice, love, courage, fortitude, compassion. Think of all those things as virtues. So virtue is what all virtues have in common. That's the relationship of God to the good. Well, you may think, how would that manifest itself in your life? Well, that might be pursuit of the good. And that's the pursuit of the good that unites all proximal goods. Well, what is that exactly? Well, it's something like belief that it would be for the best that all things flourish to the degree that that's possible. When I was a clinician, I thought of that as the good in me serving the best in my clients. And I think the desire for that to happen, that's love. So that's the desire for, you say, well, you take a human, bent, broken, miserable, malevolent, hurt, corrupt, weak, frustrating, disappointing, all of those things that we can lay on ourselves because of our inadequacies. It's like, it's easy to dismiss that. And part of that dismissal is what drives the notion that the planet has too many people on it and that we're a cancer on the face of the earth. It's like, it's not easy to love that. But what do you want? You want the broken people to rise up out of their brokenness rather than despise them for it. And then you orient yourself towards that and try to pull that out of people and yourself. Keep facing challenges voluntarily, pay attention at a rate that works for you, develop your competence. That actually stabilizes the environment around you. So it actually is less predictable and less threatening. Plus you accrue that evidence and you get the social support for doing so. That's your best pathway forward. How do we come to know ourselves in terms of our personalities and, more importantly, potential? One of the first ways to come to know yourself is to understand that you don't. You can learn to kind of watch yourself like you're watching a stranger. So you have to understand that you don't know who you are. And that's not easy to understand because you think you know. But then, you remember you can't control yourself very well. You're not very disciplined. You're full of flaws. Maybe you don't know yourself as well as you think. But it's hard to get low enough to understand how deeply it is the case that you are ignorant about who you are. Now, there's an upside to that too, which also is that you're also ignorant about who you could be. And so the discovery of that, is some reward for the horror of determining who you actually are. Then you watch yourself. You watch yourself like you're watching a stranger. You watch what you say and you listen. And you think, well, what sort of person would say that? And how am I reacting emotionally when I'm communicating in that manner? Is that making me feel stronger or weaker? Is it filling me with shame? Is it helping my confidence? Am I laying out a lie? Am I deceiving myself and other people? Am I adopting this personality at parties that is designed to impress and to amuse, and it comes across as nothing but like self-centered narcissism? What are my dark fantasies? What are my aggressive fantasies? What is it that I'm willing to do? What am I interested in so that I'll spontaneously pursue it? What do I procrastinate about and why? What am I unwilling to do? What do I think is good? What do I congratulate myself for accomplishing? And what do I berate myself for failing to confront and to implement? Those are all incredibly complicated questions, and you don't know the answers to them. So that's a start. And then in terms of potential, well, you'll discover a little bit more about your potential as you discover who you are, especially the darker parts of yourself, because then you discover your potential for mayhem. There's some real utility in that. A discovery that you're dangerous. It's such a useful discovery. It's actually something that strengthens you, because the first thing that a realization like that can, in fact, produce is the ambition to incorporate that danger into a higher order personality. And that can make you implacable. That can make you someone who can say no when you need to say no. That can make you someone who won't avoid necessary conflict. And so that's unbelievably useful. And so that's one of the potentials that you might discover. The other thing you do to discover your potential is you challenge yourself. It's like take a bit of a look at yourself and think about what's not so good that you could improve, that you should improve by your own standards, and that you would improve, and set yourself a little goal. Maybe you're not studying at all and you're at university, or maybe you're at work and you've got this stack of paper there, and you haven't looked at that damn stack for like a month, and you know that you should be, and you're bothering yourself at night because you're avoiding that. It's like maybe think, well, I've avoided that stack of paper completely for 1 month. I'm quite a coward when it comes to whatever snakes might be hidden in that stack of paper. How about tomorrow I just put that stack of paper in front of me on my desk and I glance through it for 15 seconds. See if I can do that. It's like, well, you set yourself a goal of improvement. It's a humble goal. There's things you could do to improve, and you know what they are. And there's small steps that you could take, that you might take, that would put you in that direction. And then the question is, are you big enough to take those small steps? Are you capable of grappling with the fact that you're fundamentally flawed to the point where you have to break things down into almost childlike steps in order to manage them? And the answer to that is, yeah, you are. Most people have things they avoid, and they're afraid of. So I would say to some degree, it's the lot of everyone. People vary in the degree to which they've conquered that. And you do meet people from time to time who are extraordinarily disciplined. But most of the time, they've got disciplined in exactly this manner. It's through slow incremental improvement. And then you challenge yourself. It's like, well, could I do this? That would be better. And then you find out. And then you think, well, is there something slightly larger and more challenging that I could do that would be better? And you try it and you find out. And as you try it and you find out, generally you get better at it and you can take on larger and larger challenges. You take responsibility for yourself. That's part of standing up straight with your shoulders back. It's like, take on the world, man, but only at the level that you can manage. When you're ignorant and biased and deeply flawed and immature, it's where everyone starts. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew, but it doesn't mean that you can't wrestle with part of reality. Some part that's small enough so that you have a good shot at victory. And then you attain victory over some small part of the chaos. And then you're the person who's victorious over chaos. You're just a beginner, but that's who you are. And then maybe you can get unbelievably good at that. And you do that by challenging yourself humbly at the level that you're able to function. It's easier to understand if you think about a child that you're trying to rear properly, and you want to make that child, help that child reveal their highest potential, whatever that is, whatever that means. And what you do is you don't set them a series of impossible tasks in the hope of undermining their self-confidence. You form a relationship with them that is predicated on your interest in their highest mode of being. And then you offer them challenges that are precisely optimized to their ability, right? So they can do them, but they have to stretch. The two elements of their ability would be what they can do and how much they're capable of transforming what they can do. And an optimal challenge stretches you to the end of what you can do and then into the domain of how you can transform. You have to be humble and wise enough to understand that you might have to aim pretty damn low, especially in those places where you're not functioning well. And it might be so embarrassing that you can't bring yourself to fathom that that's actually who you are. You need the loss of that arrogant ego because it's precisely what's interfering with your movement forward. It's part of the adversarial process, mythologically speaking, that stops moral progress. You're too proud of who you think you are to notice what you're like so that you could change properly. You don't want to sacrifice that part of yourself. It's probably associated with some delusion that helps you maintain a positive, although very fragile self-image, in the absence of genuine effort. It's not to be recommended. So you know yourself by watching and paying attention. It's not thinking exactly. It's not imagination. It's watching like you're a snake. Because a snake watches like cold-bloodedly with no emotional reaction just to see what's there. It doesn't allow what is wanted or desired to interfere with what is observed. So you watch yourself like that, as if you don't know who you are. Well, that's the beginning. And then you challenge yourself continually to see how far past yesterday you can push today and tomorrow, and to continually experiment with expanding the domains not only of your competence, but of your ability to increase that competence. The upper limit to that is proportional to the moral effort that you put into it. The more that's guided by the highest of all possible visions, right? The alliance with the highest of all possible conceivable good. The more it's accompanied by truth in speech and action, the more you will develop your potential. And I believe that potential to be as unlimited in the upward direction, more unlimited in the upward direction than it is unlimited in the direction that brings people to the political and social hells that so often characterize the world that we inhabit. And so you also, I suppose, have to be willing to undertake that as an adventure, because it's a hell of a thing to bear that kind of responsibility. It takes a person out of the ordinary. It takes them out of themselves. But there's deep meaning to be had in it, and there isn't anything better that you can do.
There's this idea in the Old Testament that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and it's a pretty harsh idea.
But there's something really useful about it, because one of the things you see with people all the time is that maybe they're trying to stumble forward towards their ideal, as poorly defined as it might be, but then they're afraid, right? They're afraid about what they might encounter, and that stops them, because fear does stop people. It freezes you like a prey animal, and so people move ahead, but then they get afraid, and then they stop moving ahead. And that's not so good, because negative emotion is a really powerful motivator. So we're more motivated by negative emotion than positive emotion. Quantitatively speaking, you can measure that. And that's, I think, because we can only be so happy, but we can really be suffering and dead, So we have to pay more attention to the negative. And that's bad, because the negative can stop you. And then in my clinical practice, I often talk to people who are trying to make a difficult life decision, and they're weighing out the costs and the benefits of making the life decision, And one of the things I always talk to them about is, wait a second, that's an incomplete analysis. You have to weigh out the benefits and the costs of doing this. And you have to weigh out the costs and benefits of not doing it. And that's not the same as the zero that you assume that you're starting with, right? Because to not make a decision, it also has a cost. And sometimes the cost of not making a decision is far worse than the cost of making a decision, even if the decision is risky. And so one of the things you can derive from that, and this is very useful, I think, is that this is also, I think, why it's so useful to contemplate your mortality, so to speak, is you're screwed no matter what you do. And that actually frees you, is that you have path A that has catastrophes, and you have path B that has catastrophes, and you don't get to have the no catastrophe path, but you get to pick which one. And that's really something, because if you know that there's terrible risk associated with everything that you do and don't do, then you can afford to take some risks, because you're not, and this is all within the ark metaphor. I'm still making the case that despite the fact that your life is essentially catastrophic, you can make a covenant with the highest ideal, and that will take you through it the best way possible. I'm still making that case. So then you think, okay, well, I'm trying to make this decision. I'm going to go try to do something difficult. And isn't that terrifying? And then you think, yeah, but wait a minute. What's really terrifying is not doing it. And then you think about the cost of not doing it. So in the future authoring program, we have people do this little meditative exercise, which is, okay, just think about your insufficiencies by your own definition, right? The way that you don't do what you know you should do. About the things that you do that you shouldn't do, that you know you shouldn't do beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? There's some things like that. And that's bad habits and poor aim and all of the resentment and hatred and aggression and unresolved conflicts and all those things that are dementing you and warping you, and then think, okay, those things get the upper hand, man. They get the upper hand, and they take you the worst possible place you could go in the next 3 to 5 years. What exactly does that look like? And so you sketch all that out, and you think, hey, I don't want to go there. And so the next time that a temptation comes up, you think, well, it'd be a lot better for me if I didn't succumb to this temptation. It's like, that's kind of weak, eh? You'd look a little better if you didn't eat like a cheesecake a day or something like that. That's something, but it's not the same as, I'm going to have diabetes and I'm going to lose my damn leg in 5 years if I don't get my eating under control. That's motivating. And so then the temptation comes along and you think, oh, how about no? Seriously, how about no? Not just because a higher good would be obtained if I avoided it, but because a terrible catastrophe would be averted if I didn't. And so you want to get your fear behind you, right? You want to get it behind you where it's pushing you forward instead of in front of you where it's stopping you. And you get your fear behind you, pushing you forward by actually thinking through the consequences of not putting your life together. And the least of those is that you waste it and suffer, right? Because you're going to suffer anyways, man. So you waste it and suffer. That's a bad deal. Because maybe if you're going to suffer, you could at least do something noble and glorious and upright and powerful and honorable and admirable and helpful and difficult. That's just so much better. And maybe that's good enough so that you think, hey, little suffering, it's basically worth it. At least it's a way forward, At least it's a way forward. Beauty is one pathway towards God. And if you can't find another pathway, then why don't you use beauty? I'm sure most of you do that with music, because music is the one thing that modern people can't be cynical about. Thank God for that. And I've been fascinated by music because of that. It speaks meaning to people, right?
I've mentioned to people that they should clean up their rooms. That's become quite the internet meme. But I'm really serious about it because it's really hard to do that. And I've been cleaning up my room, by the way, for about 4 months now because my life was thrown into such a catastrophe and also we were renovating. And so, but it isn't just that you clean it up, you also make it beautiful. And it's really hard to make something beautiful. And it's really worthwhile. And what's really cool is if you learn to make something beautiful, even one thing, if you can just make one thing in your life beautiful, then you've established a relationship with beauty. And then you can start to expand that relationship with beauty out into the world, like into other elements of your life. And that is so worthwhile. It's just incredibly, crazily worthwhile. And that's an invitation to the divine. You have to be daring to do that. And people are terrified of it. People are terrified of color. They paint their walls beige. They're terrified of art. They buy some mass-produced thing because they don't want anybody laughing at them for their lack of taste. Because what do you know, right? You have to develop it. And so you're going to stumble along and make mistakes to begin with. It's kind of hard on your self-esteem, but you're stumbling towards the kingdom of God. That's what you're stumbling towards when you try to make an aesthetic decision and to put something in your life that's beautiful. And it's unbelievably worthwhile to do that. Man does not live by bread alone. That's exactly right. We live by beauty. We live by literature. We live by art. And literally, not metaphorically. We cannot live without it because life is too dismal and tragic in the absence of the sublime. And ourselves, we have to be sharp so that we can survive properly and orient the world properly and not destroy things, including ourselves. You are somewhere, you're a certain way, you're moving forward, something happens that you don't expect, it blows you into pieces, it introduces chaos, right? You face the dragon, you get the gold, or maybe the bloody thing eats you and the story is over. And then you get to where you're going. But then the question is, well, what happens when you get to where you're going? And that's a really important issue because one of the things that happens to people all the time in their life is that they get to where they're going and then they don't know what to do, right? So, for example, you graduate from university. It's like, okay, story over. Who are you now? Who are you the next day? And so what happens is when you succeed, then there's a success crisis. And the success crisis is, well, I've run this story to its end. Now what? What you should do when your story comes to an end, when you've achieved what it is that you want to achieve, when you've achieved what you need to achieve, then the next question is, okay, well, now I'm that person or I have that character. What do I need to do next? And some of that is always, well, what do I need to give up now? What do I need to let go of so I can move to the next plateau, right? Assuming that your life is a sequence of upward moving. It's like Sisyphus, except you're actually, each time you climb up the mountain, you get a little higher on the mountain. It's something like that. So it's Sisyphus with an optimistic bent. And maybe if you push the rock up the mountain properly and let it roll down, and if you do that right, then it's okay. Every time you roll it back up, it's better in some sense. One of the experiences I've had in my life, fairly commonly, in a variety of different ways, this is especially true when I was paying a lot of attention to my dreams, which I did for about 15 years, I guess, something like that. Now and then I would feel like I'd learned some things and had sort of consolidated them, and then before I went to sleep, I'd think, okay, I'm ready to learn something else. It's like, and I didn't say that without trepidation, and because usually when you learn something, it's not that pleasant, because you usually learn something about why you're wrong. And the deeper the thing that you learn, the more you learn about why you're wrong. And there's a death that's associated with that, because then you have to let that part of you that's wrong die. And that's the sacrifice, right? And so you have to make a sacrifice. You have to be willing to make a sacrifice before you're going to learn something. Perhaps what you'll learn is in proportion to your willingness to make a sacrifice. And I really do believe that. I do believe that as well, because I also think that if you commit to something, that means that you don't do a bunch of other things, right? So that's the sacrifice of all those other things. You commit to it and you set your sights on it. If you really commit to it and you get the sacrifice right, so to speak, then the probability that that thing will be successful vastly increases. And I think that that's also not a naive way of thinking or a foolish way of thinking. My experience has been that that's the case.
What's the meaning of life?
I think the meaning is to be found in that. And as you put things together, and as you take responsibility for things, that meaning emerges from that. And so it emerges from that the same way it emerges from a symphony, in some sense, because a symphony is composed of layers of patterns, and they're all working harmoniously together. And they speak directly to people of meaning, which is why people love music so much. I mean, every form of music does that. And it's a model for proper being, which is the placing of all the different levels of reality into harmonious relationship with one another. And meaning emerges out of that naturally. And meaning is actually an instinct. This is another thing that people don't understand, and it's a case I've been able to make because I know a fair bit about how the brain works. The twin hemispheres of your brain interact to guide you through life, which is a truism in some sense. You use your brain to guide you through life, but your brain does that fundamentally by instilling the proper things that you do with a sense of meaning. And that meaning it's not something that's just a surface. It's not on the surface of the world in some sense. It's the deepest instinct that you have. It's associated with a phenomenon that Russian neuropsychologists discovered back in the 1960s called the orienting reflex. And the orienting reflex is what orients you towards things of interest. Right. And that happens unconsciously. And so if something happens around you that's of significance, often something you don't expect, say something somewhat chaotic, you'll orient towards it, and that attracts your attention. And then as you investigate what that is, that's associated with a sense of meaning. And if you put what you're investigating into proper order, then that meaning continues to reveal itself. So you can use meaning as a guide to proper being. But you have to also be very careful to conduct yourself honestly if you're going to do that, because if you conduct yourself dishonestly, then you pathologize the mechanisms that orient you. Everybody is a strange mixture of victim and victimizer. Lots of terrible things happen to people that aren't justifiable in some sense. Illness strikes people randomly. Yeah. I mean, not entirely randomly, obviously, but there's a large random element in it, where you're thrown into existence as a consequence of your birth, that you're sort of thrown into reality with your particular set of predispositions and weaknesses. And then there's going to be times in your life where things twist in a manner that's unfair to you, that you're not getting your just deserts. But that goes along with all sorts of unequally distributed privileges as well. And so that's the arbitrary nature of existence. But you can't allow those sorts of things to define you, because it's not that useful strategically. When you're playing a card game, you're dealt a hand of cards. Yep. Well, what do? You play the hand the best you can. Why? Because all the hands are equal? No. Because you don't have a better strategy than playing the hand that you're dealt the best you can. And that doesn't even mean it'll be a winning strategy. But because people don't always win, sometimes we lose, and sometimes we lose painfully, and sometimes we lose painfully and unjustly. Mm-hmm. That's not the point. The point is you don't have a better strategy, and neither does anyone else. And then it's also not so obvious how privilege and victimization are distributed. If you take someone who's doing quite well in life and you scratch underneath the surface, you generally don't have to scratch very far until you find one or more profound tragedies of the past or perhaps of the present. And no matter how well protected you are in the world, you're still subject to illness, you're still subject to aging, you're still subject to the dissolution of your relationships, the death of your dreams, death itself. So vulnerability is built into the structure of existence. Now, if you start to regard yourself as a hapless victim, or even worse, an unfairly victimized victim, well, then things go very badly sideways for you. It's not a good strategy. You end up resentful, you end up angry, you end up vengeful, you end up hostile. And that's just the beginning. Things can get far more out of hand than that. So strategically, it's a bad game. It's better to take responsibility for the hand that you've been dealt. You've got no better protection in life than doing that. We've had a long conversation in our culture about the necessity for self-esteem and happiness. And that's not what I'm talking about. I tell my audiences and my readers very straightforwardly that life is difficult and that there's a lot of suffering in it, and that you have to learn how to conduct yourself in the face of that. The problem with the pursuit of happiness is that when life storms come along, happiness disappears, and then you're left with nothing. And so you need to pursue something that's deeper than happiness. And if happiness comes along, well then, hooray for you. You don't want to despise it because it's fleeting, but it's much better to pursue things that are meaningful than things that make you happy. It's deeper and it orients you more appropriately and it keeps you centered in your own life. It makes you more useful for your family and your community. So that's one thing. And it's a relief to young people to know that the baseline conditions of life are difficult, but that you can still prevail. So it's a funny message in some sense, or a strange message, because on the one hand, it's somewhat pessimistic. Mm-hmm. Now, I talk about suffering and malevolence also, but I also emphasize the fact that despite that being the base conditions of existence, people are tough enough to prevail. So that's one element of it. The other element is the necessity of responsibility. So a lot of what people find in life that provides them with a sustaining meaning is a consequence of not the pursuit of rights or the pursuit of happiness or the development of self-esteem, but the adoption of responsibility. And the more responsibility, in some sense, the better. Responsibility for yourself, for making sure that your life lays itself out like it should. Responsibility for your family, responsibility for the community. It's people who take responsibility that are the ones that you admire. And that's the right pathway through life. That's where meaning is to be found. Even though life is suffering, if you're sufficiently courageous and forthright and honest, let's say, in your approach, and you don't shy away, what you'll find is that there's something within you that will respond to the challenge of suffering with the development of ability that will transcend the suffering. So the pessimism is, yeah, well, life is rife with problems at every level. But the upside is, if you turn and confront that voluntarily, that you'll find something in yourself that can develop and master that. And so the optimism is nested in the pessimism. And that's extremely helpful to people, especially people who are struggling, because they think, oh my God, life is so difficult. I don't know if I can stand this. There must be something wrong with me. Does anybody else feel this way? And you can say, yes, everyone feels that way at some time. But that's, and it is as bad as you think, but you're more than you think you are. You're more than you think you are. The goal in life is to conduct yourself so that life improves, at least so that undue suffering is forestalled. But more than that, so it's to constrain malevolence and suffering to the degree that that's possible. But then also to work for a positive improvement in things at every level. And that's how you should orient yourself. One of the things about what I do is that I'm always trying to take high-level abstract truths, fundamental truths, and to make them concrete and practical so that you can implement them in your day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. Because it's the connection between those abstractions and practical action that really cements their meaning and makes them comprehensible. Yeah. And this idea of incremental improvement is a great one. If there are things about your life that are bothering you, or things about the world that are bothering you, then you want to decompose them into solvable sub-problems. And you do this, if you have a child, this is the sort of thing that you do naturally, right? Because you want to set your child a challenge that's sufficiently challenging to push them forward in their development. So that makes it meaningful for the child. That puts them in the zone of proximal development, which is where proper maturation takes place. They'll find that intrinsically meaningful. You want to make it challenging, but also with a reasonable probability of success. And there's an art to that. So you want to set yourself a task that's difficult, but not so difficult you can't attain it. Mm-hmm. And then what happens is that you step up improvement across time, incrementally. And there's also a certain element of humility to it, right? Which is, don't bite off more than you can chew, right? Don't set grandiose goals, but incremental improvement will get you a tremendous distance. What you do as a clinician, as a clinical psychologist, as a psychiatrist, is if people are afraid of something that's standing in their way as an obstacle, like maybe you're trying to develop your career and you're afraid of public speaking. Well, I could try to calm you down about your fear and protect you from the challenge that would be associated with public speaking. You say, well, you never have to do that. Or I could say, no, look, you have to learn to present yourself more effectively in public if you're going to develop your career. and you're afraid of it. So let's break down what you're afraid of into 10 steps or 20 steps until we can find a step that's small enough so that you can actually master it. And let's assume that with 3 years of diligent practice that you could become a competent public speaker, at least one that isn't terrified. And with 5 years, you could become an expert. And let's decide how relevant that is to your future prosperity and thriving. And then let's assume that if you break it down properly and take it on step by step in this incremental way that we discussed, that you'll actually master every single bit of it. And the thing that's cool about that is all the clinical evidence shows it works. And not only that, that's actually how you learn in life.